it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote address speaker. Ambassador Roger Meece served as the United States Ambassador to Malawi, Democratic Republic of Congo, and as well the Chargé d'Affaires in Nigeria and to Ethiopia. He has a tremendous resume of foreign service on the continent, and we're very, very pleased to have him. In 2010, he was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as his special representative for the Democratic Republic of Congo and head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, MONUSCO, until July of this year. He was doing that mission. He now tells me that he is looking towards less engagement and more retirement. I somehow don't think, we're going to let him do a lot of that, and two, I think he'll keep very active as he is passionate about Africa and peace and security. We're extremely honored to have a good friend of the Africa Center, so please welcome Ambassador Meece to the podium.
Bonjour, good morning. I will not try to cover the other languages represented in the room, just French and English. But it's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you here today. I was asked to talk about peacekeeping and challenges. As I was thinking about what to say, my first thought was simply to say that peacekeeping is very complicated, very comprehensive. It involves virtually all aspects of security questions, political and economic development, social aspects, and other sociological kinds of issues, and many other factors, and then close my presentation and open the floor for questions. However, since yesterday's remarks noted that peacekeeping is complicated, I decided I had to go a little bit beyond that and say something else. And so in choosing what to address among the vast range of questions associated with peacekeeping, I'm going to try to focus on two specific areas. One is protection of civilians, which is increasingly becoming a major, if not central, focus of almost all peacekeeping operations. And related to that, and expanding on that, the use of force, persuasive force, or peace enforcement, or offensive operations, or robust peacekeeping. The vocabulary changes, but all of it focused generally in that area, and is certainly a very topical question associated with MONUSCO. I will be speaking as much from my experience over the past 3 years from the UN. So although my badge says United States, I will be speaking as much with a blue hat as much as from an American perspective, I think. And we'll certainly look forward to your questions as well. Protection of civilians has become, certainly for the UN, the central focus of the Security Council. In the case of MONUSCO, it was made explicitly clear that this was the priority mandated task, and I think this will be increasingly the case, at least for the foreseeable future, arising out of Security Council mandates and resolutions. But that's a very broad topic and can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. In my opinion, and certainly approaching the task in MONUSCO, I tended to view this at two levels. One was what I have called the immediate term. That is to say, sorry, I need to click two buttons. So trying to click two buttons at the same time is challenging my physical skills. There we go. The immediate challenge of protection of civilians, meaning protecting civilians against the threat or the realization of imminent attack by armed groups or whatever the nature of the threat is that is threatening them. So I put that in the category of immediate. and of course encompasses a lot of different aspects, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And long-term, meaning things that you have to do to ensure that years down the road, the threat to civilians is decreasing. Notably, that includes capacity building or institution building, so that the need for a peacekeeping force, external peacekeeping force, is no longer required. It may have other aspects to it as well for the long term, and is a somewhat different kind of operational challenge than the task of immediate protection. It involves, and certainly absolutely essential in my opinion, is both military activities as well as civilian. And this is easy to say, but as I discovered with MONUSCO, much more difficult to accomplish. When I arrived and took up duties in MONUSCO, and I had seen this from outside as ambassador from previous years, there tends to be a gulf that opens up even within the mission, much less other agencies, between the military and civilian components, with each side tending to regard the others with some degree of suspicion or a feeling of somehow they don't really understand. At the risk of oversimplifying, there tends to be, at least by some humanitarians and NGOs, a sense of, well, those military people, they just want to go out and kill people and do their military thing. And on the military side, there tends to be sometimes a feeling of, well, all those humanitarians have nice intentions, but they can be a bit naive. They don't necessarily understand the hard realities of a security situation. And so we have to be a bit careful in dealing with them. This requires bridging the gap to actually build an integrated and comprehensive strategy. And it requires, in my view, a concerted ongoing effort by people on both sides, as well as the general leadership, to ensure that that integration takes place and that gulf is bridged. I think we were able to do a great deal of that, but partly because of personnel rotation, partly because of other factors, it is not something that you can ever consider to be, we've done this, it's an accomplishment, c'est un acquis, and we go on. It's something that requires an ongoing dialogue and ongoing effort. Women as peacekeepers. We certainly did not have, in my opinion, enough women in our peacekeeping forces, and I include both military and police in that category. And I think that's probably true, broadly speaking. It is not that easy to identify and recruit women, but it seems all but self-obvious to me that in almost all conflict situations, it is women who are often suffering the greatest consequences of the conflict. It is women who have a great deal to bring to bear in terms of finding solutions and long-term possibilities for how to advance, and it is women who don't often have the same role or the same access to the institutions of power. And so having an increased representation of women and peacekeepers, as peacekeepers, I think is essential. And of course, there is certainly in Congo, as well as other conflicts, the aspect of a particularly serious problem of sexual-based violence. And of course, the women, the civilian women in the region can relate to the women in MONUSCO, both military and civilian, the peacekeepers, in a way that is often not the case with men. And the photo there, by the way, is a South African soldier with MONUSCO. Other photos, this is a part of an engineering battalion, which is also part of the greater development and stabilization efforts, as well as the civilian agencies. This red report is something that I would commend to everybody. The World Bank puts out annually a World Development Report annually. That's the 2011 cover, which dealt with institution building of countries emerging from violence, not simply conflict. And among other things, I find it very interesting reading, and I've recommended it to many. It underscores the fact that institution building and getting effective governance structures is not a short-term issue. even under ideal circumstances, this takes a lot of time. And yet the Security Council, many governments, tend to have a very short-term window in terms of looking at how they want to realize progress and see things happen. So within this overall challenge of peacekeeping and protection of civilians, how did we deal with this in MONUSCO, and how did we approach the problem? Well, let me try to give you an indication of that. The good news for you right now is that I am not intending to try to explain this slide. I'm not going to go through all of the acronyms and the situation. It is simply to try to provide a bit of context for you if you're not familiar with the Congo and the situation in terms of the task facing MONUSCO. The various colored circles and ovals here represents areas of activities of various armed groups. And this only gives you a flavor of the listing, the legend on the side of what are some of those armed groups. The areas that MONUSCO was covering operationally, which includes South Kivu Province, North Kivu, a very small bit of Katanga, and 3 districts of Province Oriental, Ituri, Haut-Uélé, and Bas-Uélé districts. The area under consideration there covers a landmass the area that is larger than Afghanistan. So you've got a huge area, largely lacking infrastructure, a bewildering array of armed groups, and within those, particularly the Kivu provinces, there's often a shifting array of alliances. Partly to deal with this, MONUC, now MONUSCO, over the years developed a system of advanced bases referred to as COBs and TOBs, company operating bases and temporary operating bases, to try to extend the reach of the area being covered. At any given time during the last 3 years, there were usually in excess of 90 of those bases operating, with an overall military troop deployment of roughly 18,000 troops. So people have sometimes spoken of MONUSCO as being the world's largest peacekeeping operation, the largest number of troops, all of which sounds impressive until you start putting it in this context, and suddenly it becomes not so large. I might add, by the way, that this use of COBs and TOBs effectively addresses the question of being able to reach a larger area, particularly given the lack of infrastructure, but it compromises the principle of concentrating your forces in terms of potentially what you might want to do using your military forces. So it effectively reflects an operating philosophy of a defensive-based strategy, which is consistent with the general principles of contemporary blue helmet UN peacekeeping. And that's basically what was happening. I might add finally as a note, MONUSCO has an authorized troop ceiling by the Security Council of 19,815. I won't try to explain where that number came from, but that's the ceiling. However, during much of the time, most of the time I was there, as I say, the effective troop deployment was on the order of about 18,000 troops. Within that, what did we do? Well, we tried to develop this integrated strategy, building on civilian-military collaboration, coming together with a strategy to try to put in place what would not only deal as effectively as possible with this imminent threat of armed groups, but looking long-term as to how do we develop or help develop the capacity with other partners so that a UN peacekeeping operation would no longer be needed. And MONUC and MONUSCO has already been in the country for quite a long time. And within that, the mission developed quite a few innovative practices which are now being applied by the UN beyond that. and they are captured by some of this parade of acronyms. The JPTs refer to Joint Protection Teams, JAMs refer to Joint Assessment Missions, both of these being things that involved elements of the military, police, and civilians in going out, assessing threats, assessing what has happened, assessing what performance. CAN refers to Community Alert Networks, part of a mechanism to try to improve the ability to get information coming in, to provide a reaction time when something was happening. CLAs refers to Community Liaison Assistance. These started out as interpreters to help bridge the gap of communications, particularly between military forces and local civilians. Even in the case of Congo with Francophone troops, and there weren't that many Francophone troops, there was a communication problem because in the rural areas, French did not help very much. You needed a capacity in the local language. So they started out as interpreters, but we discovered that there was great value beyond simply interpretation, and that was helping to bring an understanding of what you were seeing in the local village or the local environment so you could understand what was going on. I used an example with some people in New York in the Security Council saying, if I were to go into a small Indian village and there was something a bit wrong, I might be oblivious to it. I might not have any idea of what was going on because I'm not attuned to the local cultural cues of what's wrong. If I go into a small American town and there's something wrong, there's probably a good chance I'll pick up on it. Something's not right here. There is something that needs further explanation. The CLAs can help do that. And we found enormous value, and we dramatically expanded the number of CLAs to be assigned to not only all of those TOBs and COBs, but generally play an increased function. And it is one of the ways that we're using to help bridge these communication and integration gaps on the mission. Military operations are obviously a central part of peacekeeping, but what I wanted to highlight here is although we had the certainly authority and right of conducting unilateral military operations ourselves, what we also tried to develop were models of joint operations with Congolese forces. This is in part because recognizing that it's their country and the first responsibility for protection rests with them. Second, part of the capacity building and an increased partnership and confidence building between the Congolese forces and our own. But this is not a simple matter either. And many of you will undoubtedly know that there has been much controversy, misbehavior by the FARDC, the Congolese forces, other problems, and there are other issues associated with that. We can talk more about that if you like and develop it. But it was very much a central part of what we were doing and a necessity in our view in terms of getting to those long-term solutions so that a UN force would no longer be needed. And then finally, a question I was referring to before, including internal mission integration across all of the channels and divisions and different offices, civilian, military, different offices tasked with different specific tasks and missions, as well as other partners, including NGOs, but notably also including a central component for the MONUSCO vocabulary. It was stabilization. You could use the word peace building. You could use the word development. There's, again, many other words that you could use, but it's that long-term aspect of getting to the solution so that peacekeeping force is no longer required. I have sometimes heard discussion, and within the UN it was a favorite theme for a while, of transitioning from peacekeeping to peace building. I always rejected that paradigm. These things have to accompany each other. You don't transition directly from one to the other. You have to have the development aspect or the stabilization aspect as much as possible at the same time that you are conducting traditional peacekeeping operations. It has to be a part of the integrated strategy. But I also found and strongly feel that in the case of the Congo, and I think many other peacekeeping operations, this was not enough. By the way, the middle photo here is a joint patrol with UN and Congolese forces. The other are some of the joint protection and assessment mission involving both civilian and military forces. The Congo is one place that I would submit, as is true in many other peacekeeping situations. UN peacekeeping is based on a contemporary blue helmet peacekeeping is based on a model of a post-conflict situation where you are maintaining a peace. But in the Eastern Congo and in many others, Mali is an example, Somalia, Darfur, there are others that you could name more easily than I. These aren't post-conflict, they're active conflict situations. So how do you deal with the active conflict? How do you deal with the conflict going on? Well, in MONUC and MONUSCO's case, as the name changed, that has been adapted and different efforts tried to deal with that over time with varying degrees of success, mixed results. But it was always kind of trying to fit the square peg into the round hole that doesn't necessarily work very well because the basic assumption is wrong. Dealing with that, wrong button, there we go. In the case of the UN, brings you also into some problems with the Security Council, because if you want to advance beyond traditional peacekeeping, the Security Council, governments and the Security Council generally don't like dealing with risk, they don't like dealing with sensitive issues, they don't like dealing with things that are controversial and try to avoid those if they can. So how do you get them to go beyond that? I think the basic dilemma, certainly I felt with the Council, is summed up by this cartoon, which I hope you can read the caption from where you're sitting. But it basically has the fellow with a briefcase saying, all we want is something new that will incapacitate the enemy without giving us bad press. Well, that, it seems to me, is often the problem. We want you to make sure that the bad guys are taken care of. There's no more threat to civilians, but don't do anything that will generate negative coverage or take risks. Well, that's not possible. So this has led to various attempts. And I would say what the Security Council as a group very much prefer is, if they can, to use a proxy to bring to bear this additional element. Somalia is a good example, with AMISOM using an African Union force with strong financial and other support from outside powers and the UN. But it kept the UN and the Security Council with a bit of an arm's length distance, so that if there were problems, well, that's not really us. It's that other force doing something. Mali, I think, is another example that is still evolving with a struggle in terms of defining who can do what. In this case, of course, France had intervened unilaterally based on their own perception of threats, and so they brought to bear an element of force. But I think, as most all of you are probably aware, there's been this ongoing debate as who should be doing what, given what is clearly an ongoing threat situation and the threat of combat. There are many other examples. There's one within Congo in terms of 2003, something that was called Operation Artemis, that was a very offensive mode operation brought by the European Union, largely France, with UN endorsement. But this is always the Council's preferred approach if there's somebody else who has the means and the ability to bring to bear that additional element. One of the problems we had, a major problem in Congo, however, is that there wasn't anybody else, generally speaking, with both the means and the will to bring that additional element in peace enforcement. In recent times, the SADC countries in particular certainly had the political will to bring to bear some forces, and I'll talk about that a bit more, but largely lacked the means. And we didn't have others with both who could bring that to bear. I certainly became convinced in Congo's case that we did need something more, that it wasn't simply a matter of, to achieve success, simple traditional peacekeeping as practiced by the UN, but we needed a capacity for peace enforcement or preemptive authority for military operations or offensive operations or whatever words you might like. And at the risk of digressing, I would note early in my tenure, there was a dinner in New York that was organized by the French permanent representative with a number of representatives from the Security Council. And at that dinner, we were talking about the FDLR, the Rwandan group that is a legacy from those involved in the genocide in '94. And I said, look, if the strategy that we've been talking about works, eventually we're going to be reduced to a hard core of senior leaders of the FDLR, surrounded by however many combatants they can keep. And these leaders, many of them were certainly directly involved in the genocide, and they're never going to voluntarily submit to anything. So how do we deal with that? And in my view, it's probably going to require basically a military solution dealing with that specific problem. And so I said to the council members, to what extent can MONUSCO be a part of that solution? You have to tell me, because we in MONUSCO can only do what you, the council, are willing to support. So you tell me how aggressive we can be. I'm willing to try to be as aggressive as possible to the extent that you are willing to authorize. Well, I asked this question as a rhetorical question. I didn't expect a definite answer. I was trying to provoke thought. And there was a bit of a silence at the table. Eventually, I hope I'm not doing a disservice quoting him, the French host said, maybe we should say robust instead of aggressive. I said, well, I'm an American, so I say aggressive, but it again underscores this dilemma. This eventually led this year to the authorization, which is something very new for contemporary UN peacekeeping, for specific authority to MONUSCO for, to use the words of the Security Council resolution, targeted offensive operations. This has been adopted in Resolution 2098, which was adopted a few months ago, earlier this year. And it's being called now within MONUSCO and the UN, the Force Intervention Brigade. Some of you represent countries who are contributing troops to this. The Force Intervention Brigade is basically made up of contingents from Malawi, South Africa, and Tanzania. It is fully integrated into the force structure of MONUSCO. The brigade commander reports to the force commander of MONUSCO, and this is the way that this is been encompassed within the MONUSCO mandate. To give you a little background, again, there was nobody else willing to come in and provide this peace enforcement authority, and to speak quite frankly, one of the reasons is that in this ongoing conflict, there is no strategic Western interest at stake. Thus, whereas you had a direct French intervention in Mali, where you had a very strong Western interest in supporting something in Somalia, where you've had various interests in various other conflict zones, there's an interest in Eastern Congo and the Great Lakes, but there is no willingness, generally speaking, for any direct intervention. SADC had developed a will and an interest to become involved, but lacked the money to do so. So this was one of the factors leading to this evolution. It's had its genesis in an initiative by the ICGLR, the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region. En français, c'est le CIRGL. ICGLR last year, early, adopted a resolution on the margins of the AU summit that proposed the establishment of what was called the Neutral International Force. And within the words of their resolution, its mission would be to eradicate armed groups and also secure the borders. Well, both of those are enormous tasks by themselves. And as it went forward, with a lot of effort and work over time, it became clear that there was not the money available to bring this into being as an ICGLR force. I might add there could have been other issues as well. If the ICGLR had fielded its own force or as an AU force in the region, you would have then had 3 military forces operating in close proximity in a very fluid and volatile zone. The Congolese Army, MONUSCO, and the Neutral International Force, which would have created obvious other coordinating issues. But in any event, it lacked the means to be able to move forward in its form. And so as the debate progressed, it increasingly, as the Congolese government proposed, said, let's integrate this into MONUSCO, and that's how it became the Force Intervention Brigade. But this was not done easily or without great problems, including within the UN hierarchy and by the Security Council. If you look at the resolution of 2098 that established the authority, it's surrounded by quite extraordinary language. It includes, by the way, Resolution 2098, this is it. In this printed version, it comes out as 17 pages of mandate, excluding the annexes. 4 or 5 pages of that is just preambular. It underscores another problem with peacekeeping, and that is levying lots of complicated tasks that you can't necessarily do. And this, I might add, was based on an expressed objective of simplifying MONUSCO's mandate. But that's another discussion that we can leave for another time. Among the wording, it said, decides that MONUSCO, for an initial period of 1 year and so forth, within the authorized existing ceiling, on an exceptional basis, without creating a precedent. Interesting language, since in my dictionary, precedent is something new that hasn't been done before, and this qualifies. But by decree of the Council, without creating a precedent, or any prejudice to the agreed principles of peacekeeping. I don't even know what that means. This was, they authorized targeted offensive operations. And all of that extra language was designed to try to accommodate the various reserves and questions by Council members, some troop contributing countries, within the UN, the hierarchy, and many others who are uncomfortable and still are uncomfortable with this approach. So this is a new experiment. I have no doubt that it will affect UN peacekeeping doctrine in significant ways. How it will affect it, of course, depends on how things evolve and what are the results. And this is just now getting underway. But it creates lots of questions, and as I noted before, there are great risks associated with this. When you're undertaking an offensive operations, the UN hierarchy said to us, don't increase the risk at all for civilians. Make sure you put in place mitigating situations so that civilians won't have any impact. Well, how are you supposed to conduct military operations without any impact on civilians? It's again that cartoon, don't get any bad press. So there's lots of problems. Adding to it, I've included this slide. This slide is actually from a presentation in 2008 where I'm sorry, there we go, 2008. And it relates to the transition period of Congo. The boxes correspond to nationalities. Again, the good news is I'm not going to try to explain all the various groups, but some of those are recognized national armies, the Congolese army, the Burundian army, the Rwandan and Ugandan armies. Some of those are armed groups, as well as additional multinational forces. There have been at different times alleged and documented connections between various armed groups and some of the national armies, lots of complexity, and virtually every group identified in those various boxes has at some time or another been charged with being part of the problem, creating issues. And so when you're sitting down and saying, okay, who is it that we need to go after? Who are the bad guys? Who represents the threat? It's not very clear. It's quite ambiguous. And this helps illustrate the ambiguity. I would suspect that although Congo may be a particularly difficult case and complicated, it's true in many other peacekeeping, most other peacekeeping situations as well. It means that you have to have a very good understanding of the political context overall to be able to fashion your tactics and operations effectively. And again, gets back to that cross-division communication and collaboration. What has now taken place, this authority for peace enforcement, I would argue is much more a political issue than a legal one. Under Chapter 7 UN authority and a protection of civilian mandate, you can interpret that quite broadly, but it gets back to you can only really go as far as the Council, or in the case of the AU or some other authorizing body, is willing to support you. It's not so much a legal question. The MONUSCO approach builds on the past joint operations and military-civilian collaboration. It's very much integrated into that. And the approach to FIB operations, the targeted offensive operations, will include, without seeking a balance to not compromise operational security, but incorporating collaboration with NGOs, the civilian agencies for human rights, for delivery of assistance, for monitoring performance to the extent possible, again, building on the experience that has been accumulated. What is going on right now is building on something that MONUC practiced in the past, and that's declaring arms-free zones. For those of you following Great Lakes News, you may have seen last week that MONUSCO declared an area between Goma and Sake an arms-free zone. Just in the last 2 days, they have gone in with active searches, arresting what the press reports is about 40 people found with arms, seizing the arms and destroying them. And the idea is to expand that, to use it as a basis for potential military operations to increase the security zone. And again, working in as close collaboration with civilian agencies. This whole operation is very controversial and continues to be, and I have no doubt will generate a lot of interest. Insofar as there is anything that goes wrong, it will invite a lot of criticism and people saying, I told you so, but I think is a necessary component to put an end to what has been a seemingly endless cycle of violence in eastern Congo. The photos, by the way, that is the Tanzanian general who is commanding the intervention brigade with incoming troops. These are South African troops who, Tanzanian, who were deployed and part of it. This illustrates the civilian component. Those are civilian IDPs, internally displaced people, during a combat zone who flocked, as they tend to one of the MONUSCO bases, in this case also covering our helicopter landing area, thus precluding helicopters from being able to get in, creating additional problems. And again, it underscores these connections between the civilian and military sides. All of this is to try to give you some flavor of the complexities and the difficulties in approaching protection of civilians. All of it underscores, I think, ambiguities and questions. There are probably more questions than there are answers at this point. There is no one model that is going to fit all circumstances. and things have to be adapted to the local environment. And there are, of course, many other aspects to peacekeeping that impact on all of this as well. But if I tried to go into any of those, I would grossly exceed my time limit and risk being physically drugged from the platform. So I don't want to have that spectacle in front of you. So I will conclude with this, but happy to hear your comments or thoughts and any questions that there might be as well. Thank you very much.